So welcome everybody. I want to start this session by acknowledging and most importantly celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose lands the Australian National University operates, and it's also the lands upon which I live. I want to pay my deepest respects to their elders past and present and emergent. And I also, particularly now that we're in Zoom land and we've got people coming from all parts of Australia, I really want to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and just acknowledge that their lands continue to be occupied by non-Indigenous Australians such as myself. And then I acknowledge that they've never ceded sovereignty and that Australia has no treaty with the First Nations. I'm Dr. Glenn Althaw. A lot of you, I can see from the list of participants, know me, but for those who don't, I work at the Fenner School. I'm a researcher and a course convener for a couple of the graduate courses, which is wonderful. I'm a multidisciplinary social scientist. My research focus is on trying to find a way to have a fair and meaningful treatment of all people, regardless of their race, gender, language, and income, but particularly in environmental issues. I'm particularly interested in how environmental racism works, and most particularly about the unfair distributions of environmental goods and bads. Just a couple of housekeeping things about Zoom. We'll have the question and answer session at the end. So can I just ask everyone to please keep your questions until then? And you can, at that point, either deliver them through voice. We can turn your voices on. I've got the God powers to allow you to talk, apparently, but also you could just type your questions into chat. I'm just going to ask if people can try to not spend too much time in the chat while Brad's talking, just because it ends up being a bit of a distraction from the actual talk. We've also got Fenner's fantastic communication and events manager, Pete, in the chat. Pete O'Rourke, who has facilitated this session. So thanks a lot, Pete. Okay, so I want to welcome our guest, Dr. Bradd Witt, who's going to talk about his important work in evaluating the Australian beef sustainability framework. Brad's a lecturer at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Queensland. So he's joining us via Zoom from far off, shut out Queensland. Brad's a multidisciplinary researcher, and he focuses on the management of rural and regional landscapes. He applies a very diverse and broad lens of intersections between social and ecological values. I've personally known Brad for a long time. He was a favourite lecturer of mine as an undergraduate. That's how we first met, but then went on to become my honours supervisor and my PhD supervisor. So I can say with absolute certainty, I wouldn't be sitting in the Fenner School or delivering a talk like this if not for Brad. He's been a fantastic mentor and friend to me, but also a really critical person in opening up minds, hundreds of student minds across the years, about the importance of really thinking about problems in a critical and complex manner as applied to environmental problem solving. To environmental problems, Brad brings an important and special ability to think very critically. He's got a discerning eye for identifying key leverage points in issues and focuses on not just the big issues, which he can, but also on the finer details, which I think is a rare talent in the sciences. So I'll be quiet now and let Brad talk. So as best we can in Zoom land, please welcome Brad. So thanks for joining us, Brad. We'd normally have some sort of applause now, but you can imagine that. And I'll mute myself and turn off my camera. So thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And thanks everyone. Thanks also Peter for facilitating and organising this. It really is a pleasure to present this work today to everyone from wherever you're sitting. I'm pretty sure with the way we're having to use Zoom and various other technologies, I'm sure Glenn will work out a way of inserting artificial canned laughter and canned clapping at some point before too long. I'm going to share the screen now so that I can get up the slides for today's presentation. And hopefully start with the first slide rather than the third slide. So I'm going to talk about one particular project today, which is this evaluation of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework that we completed earlier this year. But I'm also going to put that into a context, which is some related research that we've been doing for a while and is ongoing. So I'll talk briefly about that as well. First and foremost, of course, I want to acknowledge both the funding and the contributions of the authors to this work. So apart from myself listed there, Claire Savage, who did a lot of the work behind the scenes, doing interviews and doing the transcription and the analysis and helping with the write-up of the report. Dr. Bradd Witt, Nicole Gillespie and Anoma, there in the School of Ag and Food Sciences, who particularly helped us with some of the supply chain understanding in this project. Nicole on the trust aspects. Bradd Witt with her insights in similar issues, but particularly with the gas industry. So a diverse suite of people contributed to this project, and the funding came from Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of Queensland and CSIRO. So just acknowledging all of that up front. This is not a one-person show by any means. And the web link there at the bottom will take you to the full report on the MLA website if you're interested in pursuing more details on this. So by way of context, really, most of this for the audience that's listening today won't be a big surprise, but just to set the scene, I've put some graphs up on the screen that indicate broad social trends, particularly social trends around issues to do with sustainable food systems and particularly livestock. So on the top left-hand corner, I looked in the Factiva database, which looks at all news media globally. And I did a search for beef and sustainability within that over the last 2 decades. And we can see that the trend there, obviously 2020 is not yet complete, so the data for 2020 is a bit lower. But we can see this increasing media coverage around issues to do with beef and sustainability. Another issue that's caught a lot of media attention, particularly in recent years, is issues around veganism, and there was a lot of protests over the last couple of years, which of course got media coverage. So on the bottom left, global coverage of vegan and activism. Now, the reason why I put that there is it's indicative of a broader general trend that's going on around people's concerns with the food systems and the agricultural systems that we have globally and in Australia. And that concern really is about people wanting to know that their food systems, because food systems, of course, interact directly with the environment, that those food systems are sustainable and that they're ethical and that they don't destroy the environment and so on. So you can see that this trend that's going on in the media is reflecting social trends around food system sustainability concern. On the bottom right-hand side, I also have there a graph of, in the peer-reviewed academic literature, if we look over the same period of the last 2 decades, a growing rise in literature related to things like corporate social responsibility and so on. So those sorts of things are on the rise as well. So there's academic interest, there's community interest, and there's media interest in these issues. A little bit of background here. In the mid-2000s, we tried to start this line of research, and we had some success in that we did a project, a couple of projects, sorry, looking at urban perceptions, particularly of agriculture and environment, because there was that growing concern back then around issues to do with the effect of agriculture on the environment. There was also a growing discourse amongst parts of the agricultural sectors and industries that they felt that part of this rising concern was essentially that the urban population, which was increasing, was disconnected from food systems and rural issues, and that disconnect was leading to misunderstandings about what agriculture is and what it does and its environmental performance. So we got a report and a publication out of that work. We then tried to pursue it further, but interestingly, about 10 years ago, we actually had a lot of difficulty gaining sufficient interest to continue that as a research program. More recently, then we started to revisit that, and a couple of student projects that I want to highlight here and acknowledge. So Taylor Faulkner, who's currently doing a PhD, also did an honours looking at these issues around communications, sustainability, and particularly in the beef and the cattle area. Claire Savage also did an honours thesis looking at urban environmentally concerned people and their issues or understandings, particularly about livestock products. Claire then went on to help with the research for the current project that I'm going to report on. In 2018, we undertook a large national survey, which hopefully the first manuscript will be submitted shortly. And that was really trying to unpack the drivers behind public perceptions of the environmental performance of the cattle industry and also issues of trust. So I won't go into those in any detail, but I'll come back to them towards the end and highlight how they relate to some of our key findings. All of this body of work happened to coincide with a funding opportunity that came from the University of Queensland called a Science with Impact Fund, where the Faculty of Science, in conjunction with an industry partner, provides support to a short-term project that's helped to improve impact with industry, but also build long-term relationships. So that was the funding for this particular project that I'm going to report on. So that's enough of the background. For those of you that aren't aware, just a little bit of further context about the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. I'm aware that it's not widely known. So a lot of people in Australia at this stage are not even aware that there is a sustainability framework. The development of it, of course, predates 2017, but essentially the formal sustainability framework was launched in 2017. So we're only in the 4th year of this sustainability framework. And each year since then, there's been an annual update and an annual report through 2018, 19, and the most recent one came out about a month or 6 weeks ago. So if you want to pursue more information about that, go to the web link that's on the screen there at the moment. Obviously, that sustainability framework, the themes are up on the top. It deals with indicators and measures around animal welfare, economic resilience, environmental stewardship, and also the community and the workforce. So I won't dwell on the methods because I want to get into the results, but in a snapshot, essentially, we undertook 40 in-depth interviews for this across a very wide range of stakeholders. And I'll put a slide up in just a second to indicate the depth and the breadth of stakeholders that we interviewed. The interviews had a small quantitative component that I won't talk to today, but it was primarily semi-structured around themes such as those that are on the screen. One thing that we wanted to really get a handle on, apart from the themes that are on the screen, we wanted to know how people felt about the process of the development of the sustainability framework, not just whether it was having an impact in terms of practice change or changes on ground. Although I said we did 40 interviews, when you interview people in this industry or related to this industry, you find that people have often had multiple roles or can have different roles simultaneously. So the numbers there add up to 49 rather than 40. But the key issue here is to indicate that we got a very diverse range of internal stakeholders, ranging through producers to peak industry groups, live export, transport, and so on. We also sought out external stakeholders with a keen interest in the performance of the beef industry. We were really interested too in exploring people's understanding of sustainability and sustainability challenges for the beef industry. And throughout the interviews, apart from just asking them that question, we could get a sense of people's orientation around sustainability challenges. This graphic is really just a qualitative way of trying to get a sense of the breadth of people's perspectives. And what we've done here is got two axes. The one going vertically indicates whether people are very much about embracing change and highly flexible versus wanting control over the transition or the changes and wary of cautious of change, particularly if it's driven externally. The other axis, the horizontal one, indicates whether people are orientated more towards the business, the supply chain and the industry, or externally towards industry stakeholders and a broader community. So the dots just represent approximately where we felt each participant sat. So we can see that there's a diversity of perspectives there around sustainability challenges. Now, getting to the insights from the work, as you can appreciate, any of you that have done qualitative interview-based work, 40 interviews generates a lot of insight and a lot of data. So I'm not going to try and cover everything today. It's not possible. And the screen at the moment is just indicating some of the broad and overlapping areas of key themes that emerged from the analysis. I'm going to zoom in on a few of these as I go through the next slides and hopefully highlight some of the most important outcomes from the work. So starting with the positive side of things, almost universally with the participants in this study, this theme of a great start. So the 2017 sustainability framework was really a great start. It was sort of demonstrating that the industry was taking a proactive stance on all issues to do with sustainability, and that showed a commitment to it. The but that comes with that, however, is that a lot of people within the interviews too talked about, okay, it's well and good to have this framework out now and being reporting on it, but it's really important now that you walk the talk, that practice begins and that's transparency. So I'll come back to that again towards the end as well. So that's a big tick and a good news story for the industry, particularly for this particular framework. Lots of challenges, of course, because it's a very large industry. So when I say it's a large industry, that needs to be put into a global context. So interestingly, although Australia has a large beef cattle industry with more than 43,000 individual enterprises at the producer level, the Australian beef herd only makes up about 3% of the global beef herd. So it's a tiny fraction, but we export, I think as of last year, we became the largest exporter. So we export around about 17% of all global exported beef. So we do have a significant impact at a global level. So it's a diverse industry and it ranges from the tropical north to more intensive, smaller scale farms in the south. So different geographies, very different markets, different types of producers and so on. We also highlighted, and I won't go into these in any detail, but there were specific comments from people about particular animal welfare issues or issues around greenhouse gas emissions, and also quite a lot of discussion around issues to do with the health, safety and well-being of people working in the industry. Another big challenge that was identified by several participants is the difficulty of actually being able to get good measures that you can demonstrate changes in practice or improvements in practice in a way that's verifiable, that's independent, but isn't too costly in terms of gathering that data. Another issue that was highlighted by some participants is the danger with a reporting framework like the sustainability framework of only really reporting those things that are easy to measure or that make things look too good. An illustration of that, if we look at overall greenhouse gas emissions from the beef industry, they have been declining over the last 20 years, but to some extent, a lot of that's being driven by a reduction in land clearing in Queensland. So yes, the trend looks good, but it also relates to another complex issue to do with land clearing, which is one of the sustainability issues for the industry. I won't go into the land clearing vegetation management issue because that's an entirely different talk in its own right. There was also a theme that emerged across many of the interviews around industry communication, and I'll get to that later on, but a need for two-way dialogue rather than simply one-way dialogue around communications. Now, I said earlier that we also looked specifically on how the industry developed their sustainability framework. So we're really interested in the process of developing this framework, not necessarily the outcomes of it. So on a positive note, many of the stakeholders that we interviewed celebrated the ABSF and the way that it had been managed for bringing together quite diverse stakeholders, bringing people to the table and getting conversations going, some of which were quite difficult conversations. However, having said that, and this is one of the recurring themes, so I'll come back to this in the last slide. With an industry that has about 43,000 individual producer enterprises, covers most of Australia, a multitude of transport, processing, retail components, it's very difficult to get everyone to have the same view on whether or not the sustainability framework and its process is being too inclusive or not inclusive enough. So for example, some of the participants felt that the sustainability framework and its development needs to include many more voices, so a greater diversity of stakeholders. Others felt quite passionately that it's already been cast a bit too wide and that a lot of time's been wasted and energy wasted on what were called sort of unconstructive conversations. One of the challenges there, of course, is that if the industry embraces certain stakeholder groups and begins dialogue with those, there is the potential chance of marginalising some of the people within the industry who feel disaffected by it. There was also some confusion and uncertainty about who or which particular body specifically was responsible for actually managing the ABSF as a process. That relates to some challenges that were identified too about general governance within the industry and the complex governance structures within the industry. So the key issue here from this slide is balancing these diverse views between internal and external expectations. The ABSF specifically we looked at its capacity to build trust, and for the most part it was acknowledged that the framework is a great vehicle for doing that, providing, as the last bullet point says there, that the ABSF is a way of actually acknowledging issues and problems and then for demonstrating progress on those, rather than just ticking boxes and claiming that everything's fine. Another issue there is, and it comes up frequently under a range of themes, is changing the narrative of the industry from victim to responsible steward. I'll come back to the idea of the long tail shortly. There were also a number of sustainability challenges, aside from the framework, just broadly across the industry. So the bigger challenges included things like the diversity of views about what sustainability means. So some within the industry might feel that they already are sustainable, so what's the problem? Through to some people feeling that there's orders of magnitude of change and change in practice required. Meeting community expectations and making genuine progress on those. The risks and impacts of climate variability is seen as a major challenge, and the last few years, of course, have highlighted a lot of that. Another one there that's in bold is this idea of the long tail, or the 80-20 principle that comes up time and time again throughout the data. With a large number of people in the industry, what you find in this particular industry is that a lot of the productivity and a lot of the profitability is driven by the top 20% of producers, for example. What this means is that in terms of profitability and practice, there's a great diversity of whether people are performing really, really well or really, really struggling. And for some people, one of the challenges is how do you deal with that long tail? How can the industry facilitate, build capacity and build resilience? Some of the factors that are seen as constraints or influencing change, either in a positive or negative sense, are essentially industry accepting and understanding some of the external perceptions and expectations of them. Industry leadership was framed in terms of positive and negative issues. Some of the issues that were highlighted are that industry leadership structures sometimes inhibit the capacity to reach out, listen to community, or listen to interest groups and respond. In other cases, it's argued that the leadership isn't able to respond to internal concerns and perceptions effectively. So that's a challenge for industry. There is a view that there are still people within the industry that hold very negative perceptions around climate change, and how does that impact on the broader reputation of the industry? There's been a lot of change in things to do with extension over the last couple of decades, but I won't dwell on those sorts of issues. Communications is pretty much discussed by all participants, and it's come up in other work that we've been doing as well. In fact, it's sort of at the center of a lot of what this research that we're doing is all about. It's recognized within the participants that communications is a challenge. To some extent, industry has not been very effective in some regards in terms of communicating and communicating about its sustainability journey. But what we find in the communications is that people have a perception ranging from the only problem with communications is that we need to tell our story more, sort of a one-way view of communication, that if we just tell people what a great job we're doing, they'll just listen and they'll essentially understand. And then the other end of the spectrum is thinking more about communications as actually being able to listen and create an ongoing dialogue with a diverse range of stakeholders. So not just the consumer and the customer, but other interest groups around the beef sustainability journey. The other issue there that was highlighted and was a significant challenge is actually some of the internal engagement and communication as well. So there's all sorts of challenges there about external and internal challenges. One thing I'd really like to highlight that came through loud and clear from several participants, the carbon neutral 2030 aspirations of the beef industry that was announced last year was seen as an excellent example where it got strong coverage and great cut through. And the reason why they celebrated that as a target, so setting a target for the industry that by 2030 it would be carbon neutral, it sent a strong signal to the community that the industry was taking this issue seriously and that it was going to head towards a particular target. And it's amazing the amount of effort and the research programs and the things that are going on now in order to get that industry to carbon neutral 2030. Whether or not it gets there, it's going to get somewhere towards it within the next decade. So people really celebrated setting clear targets as a good way of communicating to the general public and other interested stakeholders that they're serious about these sustainability issues. The other interesting challenge there is we're talking here about trust in an overall industry, an industry that is very big and very diverse. And it may be very difficult to actually get your head around that and work out how to build trust at that industry scale. Whereas an individual business or an individual supply chain can work quite effectively on trying to enhance or build trust in what it does. What I've highlighted over on the right-hand side is I did a quick scan through all of the media coverage on the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. And what was interesting and perhaps disappointing is that almost all of the media coverage in terms of newspaper type coverage online or in paper form was predominantly in the rural news. So most of the coverage is only in the rural news. So to some extent, the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework has not yet had much of an impact on more urban audiences. And I suspect that might relate to why there's a lack of general understanding about this particular framework in the general community. So last couple of slides now, we got a lot of insights into what people thought were trust building mechanisms and the capacity of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework to help drive this trust building, and also things that erode trust. So I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll just pick out one or two. For example, a challenge for the industry and it relates to this idea of the long tail, is this idea here of calling in or calling out. So if people don't have the capacity, or their practice change isn't what the industry standard is expecting, how can industry deal with that in terms of calling in, building capacity, providing the opportunities around people versus calling out? So when we get individuals whose behaviour is clearly not appropriate, whether it's to do with land clearing or some other issue, it might be an animal welfare issue, how does the industry respond and call that out? Some of those issues have been a bit of a taboo subject for people in the industry for a period of time, and that relates to issues to do with industry culture. So we see that these trust eroding issues include, you know, the classic dilemma of one bad news story. So you've got 43,000 enterprises, many of which may be doing the right thing, trying to do the best they can in terms of all of the sustainability themes, but one individual doesn't perform properly, and without, you know, any surprise, media will tend to focus on that particular incident, and then that erodes trust for the broader industry. So the final slide, then we wanted to make some recommendations around the processes in particular for the ABSF, because the ABSF itself is doing a terrific job in terms of trying to identify indicators, trying to gather data, trying to work out how to measure progress and change. One of the key challenges that we've identified, and I've touched on it a couple of times in this presentation, is this second last bullet point here. We really did feel that one of the greatest challenges for the framework itself and its ongoing improvement and growth and gaining traction is trying to maintain legitimacy with its internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, because it really is a difficult situation to be in. And as industry tries to reach out to animal welfare organisations or environmental NGOs or other health and well-being providers, it may be seen by some people within the industry as not listening enough to those that are actually engaged with the industry or individual producers, for example. So reaching out too far can erode legitimacy from internal, whereas if you only focus on the internal too much, then you're not gaining traction with some of the external stakeholders. So for us, that's a key tension point for the industry in its progress over the next decade. Some advice that we think is important is to make sure that there's an ongoing mechanism to evaluate the process of the ABSF and its ongoing development, and that they already do that, but it's sort of done internally as they adapt and as they do each annual report. But we were suggesting at some longer period of time, there needs to be some sort of independent or external evaluation, partly for the transparency, partly to engage a range of stakeholders, and to just have a level of distance between those people that are evaluating the program as it continues over time. So that was one of our key recommendations, particularly for that balancing of internal and external expectations. I know I've covered a lot very rapidly there, and I'm certainly happy to answer any specific questions. So thanks, Glenn. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Brad. That was fantastic. Can I please ask for any questions from our attendees? Just type them into chat, or just type that you have a question and I can unmute you. Or there's a raise hand function as well. Do we have any questions from the audience?
There is something in the chat box.
Okay. Peter. Oh, I can't see that. Oh, there's two chat boxes. Aha.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, everybody.
There's a chat box and a Q&A. Okay.
Yep. Okay, so the top one here, Brad.
Yep.
What are the actual on-ground steps individual cattle farmers can take to become more sustainable? and what's the cost to benefit ratio of undertaking those changes? And how can urban residents assist farmers to make that change?
Okay, I think there's 3 questions in there, so I'll try and I'll deal with the first one because it raises a whole lot of issues. So one of the challenges obviously is if you're running a food business, whether it's livestock or grains or fruit or whatever it is, naturally, like all of us, you need sufficient income to maintain the business as well as make a reasonable living. So having a livelihood is important. And for those businesses that are reasonably viable and doing well, generally there's a good relationship between things like ground cover and resilience in the landscape and the environmental aspects of it. So those that are generally performing okay and doing okay from a profitability perspective tend to be doing okay. Equally, if someone is struggling, then they may not be going so well with their sustainability performance. So there's a lot of research, there's a lot of extension that happens, whether it's through MLA or whatever, trying to help with practice change, you know, on the farm. How do I get better at running my business? So, and of course for landholders, the way we might as external parties, we kind of see the environment and then the business and then the social as these separate things. For them, clearly, they're all together. You know, they're inherently and complexly mixed, but they're everyday challenges for them. So there's a lot of activity going on around the information, the extension, how do we get improved productivity at an individual farm scale. It's very difficult because a lot of enterprises are not viable in their own right. So a lot of farmers in Australia have to have some form of other diversification in terms of their income, whether they work or one of the partners works or whatever they do. So they're often doing multiple things. And if you can think about that, that's not that easy, trying to run a business and then work in a job. You sort of split into 2 different things to try and specialize in. So that's just a general comment about that. The comment, the last one I think was more about, so what can consumers do?
Urban consumers in particular.
Urban consumers in particular is exercise their judgment about what they think is important from an ethical perspective or the value, or so what are the things in the products that they're purchasing, whether it's livestock or any other product, that they're prepared to pay that little bit more for consistently. So not just once in a blue moon, but what are they consistently prepared to look for and ask for? You know, in the interviews and in other work that we've been done, don't be afraid to go to, for example, in this case, don't be afraid to go to the butcher shop and ask about, where's this come from? Tell me a bit about it. This is what I'm looking for. That stuff does feed back through the supply chain. The other thing that can happen more so in Southeastern Australia is things like farmers markets or other way of actually participating in the food system more directly and talking with people in that system. Naturally, for the northern half of Australia, it's not so easy. The food production is quite some way away from the consumer. So I hope that helps with that question.
I think so. That's an excellent answer. Just there's a couple more questions here, but I just wanted to follow up on that one short part. Does that kind of more sustainable farming, that sounds to me something that's much easier for smallholder farmers who focus on that as kind of a premium product, but that's an intuition because I don't know anything about the cattle industry, or is it something that's delivered by bigger, and is there a certification scheme and that sort of thing that people can look out for if they're interested? To put you on the spot.
No, so your first part of the question is that it's both. So there are some very small scale producers that are very successful. They will often have other forms of income as well. You know, you can get very small niche producers that will produce 20 animals for a particular butcher or a particular restaurant in Australia, through to people that might have you know, even a family scale farm that might have 40,000 animals in the one enterprise. So the scales are very different. And either one of those can be ticking the boxes. Now, I don't mean that in a cliched way, but of good animal welfare, good environmental stewardship, looking after their employees and their workforce, and being profitable, you know, and resilient. Sorry, their economic system is resilient. They can respond to drought better than people that are not necessarily as resilient. So actually, a range of those models can be ticking the boxes of sustainability. It's not necessarily one or the other. And there are a number of certification schemes. There is a huge amount of activity going on at the moment. For 3 decades, we've been talking about ecosystem services. But a lot of the research on ecosystem services tend to be on what are they?
Yeah.
You know, how do you describe them? You know, the impact of pollination on food crops is worth X number of dollars. The ecosystem service work. We're only really just starting to get to the point where we're creating actual markets around some of those things, whether it's, the obvious one is carbon. You know, there's been carbon farming type activities and carbon markets around now for well over a decade. But other things that are starting to come in are things like, well, reef water quality credits or biodiversity credits. How can they actually work within the system? Because some people would argue, I've got to be profitable from a business perspective, but now society is demanding that I also am more than just a good steward of the landscape. I've got to provide these biodiversity benefits, these air quality, these water quality, these soil benefits, but I'm not deriving any direct income from that. One might argue, well, if you're looking after those things, you're looking after your profitability, but it's always more complicated than that. So watching this space, you know, the next few years are going to be interesting in terms of, are there other markets or other mechanisms to reward what the community would expect in terms of sustainability?
Oh, great question and answer. Thank you, Matt. Next question is from Kathleen. I wondered how well the framework was applied across biogeographical regions. So I think that's asking about the diversity of different areas and how well the framework fits to different areas and their ecosystems.
Yep, they would have had never-ending discussions with different stakeholders right across Australia, both in the development of the original 2017 model and each year as it modifies and updates. Because as the question implies, the north of Australia with a 1 million hectare property is a very different environment to be operating in, where you're relying on tropical rainfall in 3 months of the year to supply feed for the rest of the year. Your market is external. So in other words, you're exporting your product, compared to, you know, the little niche farmer in Tasmania who's got 60 hectares and is supplying a particular boutique restaurant. I think they've done a pretty good job at trying to make sure that their sustainability framework is at an industry scale, and that what are the key measures so at an industry scale to demonstrate performance. It's not meant to be a reporting system for an individual farm or enterprise. And in fact, it's a good question, because I'd also like to highlight there are a large number, particularly of the larger corporate producers now, they have their own sustainability frameworks. Some of them look a bit like the ABSF, some of them look quite different. For example, the ABSF at this stage doesn't have some issues, as you mentioned with your introduction and your acknowledgement of traditional owners. The ABSF at this stage hasn't grappled with issues around reconciliation, whereas the global roundtable, and I didn't mention that at all in the talk, there is a global roundtable for sustainable beef. I won't go into that, but just to sort of acknowledge that part of their themes and things that they look at are issues like that. In Australia, there's an organic producing enterprise called OB Organic Beef, and they organic grass-fed, you know, rangeland type system for domestic and export products. And they have their own sustainability reporting framework, and reconciliation is embedded within theirs, probably because they particularly deal with the northern half of Australia in more extensive systems where there's a lot of leasehold land and so on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. Next question is from Michael. He says, thank you very much. And there was some reporting that talked about it being too rosy. With the celebration of CN30 as a goal, do aspects of that campaign fall into the too rosy category?
The too rosy category is a very legitimate concern. So in other words, if you find data or you choose the data that tells only the good stories, then clearly people are going to go, hang on, something's not right here. So whether it's reporting on, this is a bit technical, but essentially the amount of genetics in the Australian herd that has a pole gene. So one of the issues, animal welfare issues within the cattle industry is that in the past, people have traditionally had to dehorn cattle. They take the horns off them because they injure themselves, they can kill people, they cause damage to the animal. So over the years, of course, people have tried to genetically make sure that you don't have horns essentially. So a lot of the herds, particularly in Southern Australia, have that pole gene. Just a bit of background, but so one of the things that they try and report on is how much of the herd has that pole gene, so that, you know, you're trying to reduce having to dehorn animals. So you want to take that out of the system in the long run. There was some concern around the reporting of that, in that it was very difficult to actually know, well, how much of the Australian herd. So being careful with data and putting the caveats around the data. So reporting averages is not always a good thing, because there's always a huge range going on. Profitability, for example, a lot of enterprises are really struggling. The debt levels are huge. One of the major challenges for the cattle industry in Australia, and in fact farming, the value of farmland is way and above what any normal business person would invest in the capital or the machine to run their business. So, you know, you might have to pay $10 million for a financially viable farm, but it can only generate $100,000 a year. You know, it's just insane. So a lot of people are carrying a lot of debt. So reporting on profitability can be problematic. The CN 2030, I think, is actually a bit different, because they've actually set themselves an almost impossible goal. It's a little bit like a bit cliched, but if you think about the space race back in the 60s and the United States president at the time, Kennedy, just saying, by the end of this decade, we will have a person on the moon. And everyone's sitting around going, what? You know, how the hell's that going to happen? But the industry did a little bit of work. Well, they'd done a lot of work, but they did a bit of work in the background and said, you know what? If we kind of do a bit of this and do a bit of that and stretch a bit of this and really stretch on that, we can get there. It is possible to get there. And so in my view, I like that target personally, as well as what the data said, because it's actually stretching the industry well and truly outside their comfort zone. And it has generated a lot of research activity and a lot of actions. A lot of farmers now running around saying, how do I know whether I'm carbon neutral? You know, they're paying for people to come and do audits on their farm and that sort of thing to work it out. So that's at the farm scale. Meanwhile, industry is investing millions of dollars in, you know, how do you improve your pastures so you get better nutrition, faster growth, less methane emissions, right through to how do you actually manage the microbes within the rumen to make sure that you drop the methane emissions, for example. All of that activity is happening now. It wouldn't be working at the pace it's happening if they hadn't set that target. So when, I can't remember who it was that made that announcement a couple of years ago, but when he said, we're going carbon neutral by 2030, everyone was literally like the space race going, how are we going to do that? But the race is on, essentially. There's, what, 9 years and 3 months left to get there. Now, so I like that question. I actually think the carbon neutral one, they can't escape it. They are going to have to report on it. Now, even if they don't get there by 2030, if they get 90% of the way there, that is a massive change, because agriculture contributes around about 13 to 15% of Australia's emissions, and about half of that is coming from the red meat cattle sector. Not a lot globally, but from an Australian's emission perspective, that's an opportunity to cut 7%-ish out of Australia's emissions within the next 10 years. So I hope they can report on that. I don't think they're going to be able to get away with any rosy reporting, because there'll be any number of environmental scientists out there trying to measure this to actually keep a track of it.
I like the comparison with the space race. Not because we can, but because we should, maybe in this case. Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. We have a question from Richard. Just having a quick look through this. There's no one cattle industry, and I think you talked about that quite well, Brad. There's a north and south divide, both institutionally and culturally. I think you also covered that well. And so really the crux of this question is, how can the ABSF deal with the diversity of the industry?
Yeah. I'll try. I'm not in their steering committee, okay? I've reported to their steering committee, so I don't know everything that they do, but from my interactions with those people, the answer is consult, 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 and keep talking. You know, that they are ongoing, constantly talking, trying to build relationships with people with different concerns, different markets, different environments. And yeah, the point that you make is quite right. There is no one cattle industry really, and that's one of these challenges around what is trust. You know, like the survey work we've done. Can you actually trust the entire industry? Yes, I can trust that producer because I go to a farmer's market and I talk to that person. I can trust that supply chain because I can sort of see how they report and look after everything. But the whole industry is much more of an abstract challenge. The other thing that makes this a bit convoluted too is that a mistake or an issue in the United States beef industry can affect people's perceptions of the Australian industry as well. So it's not just the Australian industry, it's the performance of the cattle industries globally that has an influence on community perceptions and trust and so on.
Yeah. It sounds very difficult to manage something that diverse as an industry. Thanks, Richard, for the question. Next question is from Saul Cunningham. Did the industry see reconciliation relevant to their sustainability framework? And I would understand Saul's talking about Indigenous reconciliation and some big issues given the amount of the land that are involved, employment opportunities, and the historical wrongs.
Yeah. Not a lot of the participants, but some of them did. And if you look into the report later on, you'll see that we stick to the data that we generated through the interviews. But one of those issues, I think, I didn't really go into it, but as they go forward, they need to start thinking about where else do we look for sustainability frameworks, in what context, and what are they doing? In other words, a bit of benchmarking about where it grows. Because the ABSF, as I think most of the people in that steering committee recognise, it's not a static document. It's going to change each year. And as they communicate and consultate with different groups, what becomes the key issues or the key themes, or what are the themes under community, for example, what goes in there? So I think, given that the global roundtable has acknowledged that as an issue, it's probably likely that what's going to happen over this next decade is that will start to come into it as well. And I'm not on their committee, so I can't make that recommendation, but unless they're constantly looking out to what else is going on, what's the sort of global expectations. So I would think it's a good question. If it's not there by 2030, then there's a serious problem.
I guess there's also a lot of room in the industry as well for Indigenous cattle farmers, because there's quite a lot of those groups that own large amounts of cattle, and I guess integrating their voices into that sounds like a good way forward. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. We'll do one more quick question. Thanks so much, Saul. Matt says thanks, Brad, great answers. A question from Sally Wilson. What are some of the main differences in stakeholder views around what constitutes sustainability in beef farming?
Yeah, okay. Because we've only got a couple of minutes, I'll try and wrap it up by thinking about it in terms of a spectrum. So there are some people that spoke about people in the industry, so not necessarily them themselves, that say, we're sustainable because we've been doing this for 200 years. There's sort of that view that, well, I'm still here doing what I've been doing, for 100 years or whatever, therefore I'm sustainable. Whereas other people think sustainability is an ongoing ever-changing catch up, or trying to get ahead of ever-changing values. So whoever would have thought for the cattle industry 20 or 30 years ago that global emissions were going to be an issue? Who would have thought that reconciliation would start to come on the radar? What about the mental health and well-being of your workforce? So the things that make up sustainability, you can see they're constantly actually growing, because societal values around our food systems are constantly evolving. So I think it's a good question, but we definitely recognise, and they recognise, that within the industry, there is everything from one end of the spectrum to the other, that we don't really need to change much. We're pretty sustainable, through to we've got a long way to go.
I think that goes broadly for sustainable development anywhere and everywhere. Even sustainability as a word, what it truly means. I think you ask 10 people, whether they're industry people or scientists, you'll get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
So,
and some tend to have that NRM, natural resource management kind of view. Others are much more social well-being. Others are more animal welfare type things. And of course, a lot of them about business viability and profitability.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're pretty much at our hour. So unfortunately, we won't get to the last few questions there. I believe Pete will send out the recording, or will be available, and also we'll put Brad's contact details there if you're happy to have people contact you for a chat further about this, Brad. So yes, thanks so much everyone for coming. It's great to see a lot of people in the crowd there. I can't actually see you, but I'm imagining your wonderful faces. Thanks so much to Brad for being a guest to us. And I don't really know how applause works in this situation. Usually there's at least cameras and we can all do this sort of thing. But thank you from everyone at ANU, and it's been wonderful having you along as a guest.
Thanks for the opportunity to share the work.